July 1944. You are the gunner in the 2nd Sherman in a column of 5, nosing down a sunken lane south of Caen, hedgerows taller than your tank crowding both sides of the road. The lead tank stops. Then it brews up. One hit, no warning, a wall of green hedge and a mile of open field somewhere out ahead, hiding whatever fired it. You never see the tiger. You would not have been able to hurt it if you had. Your 75mm gun could put 3 rounds square on its front plate. All 3 skipped off nearly 5 inches of steel. For 2 months, that was the arithmetic of every road in Normandy. The German tank saw you first, hit you first, and shrugged off anything you sent back. The answer, when it finally came, was a 90mm gun on a thin, open-topped tank called the M36. It was the first weapon an American crew could point at a tiger's front and expect to win. And it had been left for dead on a proving ground in Maryland a month before the landings, cancelled by the same army that would soon beg for everyone it could build. The tank that owned that road was the Tiger. On the 13th of June 1944, a British armoured column rolled into the town of Villers-Bocage, 20-odd miles southwest of Caen. The lead elements belonged to the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, veterans of North Africa. They had punched into a gap in the German line. They thought the gap was empty. Hidden in a sunken road running parallel to their route, engines off, sat a handful of Tigers from the 2nd Company of the 101st Heavy Panzer Battalion. One of those Tiger commanders was Michael Wittmann. He watched the British column halt on the road, close enough that he could count the tanks and the half-tracks and the men climbing down to stretch their legs. Some of them passed within 50 yards of his hull without ever knowing the tank was there. Then Wittmann started his engine and drove into the middle of the column alone. In the span of about 15 minutes, he knocked out somewhere between 13 and 14 British tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and more than a dozen transport vehicles. He drove the length of the stalled column and back, firing as he went, and the British gunners who managed to get a shot off watched their rounds bounce off his armour and vanish into the hedges. The Desert Rats had beaten Rommel in the desert. Here, a single tank broke their advance and turned it around inside a quarter of an hour. The day did cost the Germans. Later that afternoon, the British and their anti-tank guns caught several of the Tigers in the narrow streets of the town, and a handful of them were the first of the type lost in Normandy. That detail matters because it says the Tiger was never invincible. It could be caught in close country, ambushed and destroyed. What it could not be in the summer of 1944 was met head-on and beaten by the gun on an American tank. The men who eventually did the beating relied on terrain and numbers and nerve, and they paid for every Tiger with vehicles of their own. That is what the Tiger meant on a Norman road. The number that made it possible was the armour. The front of a Tiger carried up to nearly 5 inches of hardened steel, and the standard British and American guns of June 1944 could not defeat it at any honest combat range. The Sherman's short 75mm gun was built to throw a good, high-explosive shell at infantry and soft targets. Against the Tiger's front plate, it was close to useless. The gun the Tiger carried made the mismatch worse. Its 88mm cannon could reach out and destroy a Sherman well past 2,000 yards, far beyond the range at which the Sherman's own gun could do anything at all. So the German crew chose the ground. They sat at the far end of a field or a straight stretch of road, let the American armor come to them, and opened fire while the Shermans were still a half-mile short of being able to answer. The first thing a tank crew usually knew of a Tiger was the vehicle beside them catching fire. Only 3 Tiger battalions fought in Normandy. They did not need more. A weapon that can sit in a hedgerow and dismantle a column for the price of nothing sets the terms for a whole sector, and every American and British tank commander in the Bocage knew it. The word Tiger got attached to any German tank that fired from cover, because the fear had outrun the actual count of the machines. The Americans had no gun that could beat a Tiger from the front. The doctrine handed to a Sherman crew that summer was simple. It was also grim. Do not fight a Tiger from the front. If you meet one, put smoke between you and it and maneuver. Get a platoon around its flank while it is busy with the tank it is already burning, and try to put a round into the thinner side or the rear. It cost tanks to buy that flank. The standard tactic assumed you would trade 2 or 3 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, and American industry had decided that was an acceptable exchange because America could build Shermans faster than Germany could build Tigers. That math worked on a spreadsheet. It did not feel like winning to the men inside the tanks. A Sherman crew going up a sunken lane knew the machine that could beat them was out there and that their own gun could not reach it. The 76mm gun, a longer and harder-hitting weapon, began reaching Sherman units during the Normandy fighting. It helped. With its best ammunition, it could sometimes hole a Tiger's front at close range. Sometimes was the problem. A crew could not build a plan on a gun that might penetrate if the range was short enough and the angle was kind. They still shot for the tracks and ran. The American Army had a whole class of vehicle built to hunt tanks, and the trouble was in how they had chosen to build them. Tank destroyer doctrine called for a machine that was fast and lightly armored, a gun on wheels that would rush to a breakthrough, shoot, and get out before the enemy could reply. The armor was traded away on purpose to buy the speed. The M10, the first of them into action, carried a 3-inch gun that had done the job in Tunisia in 1943, when it could defeat most of the German tanks it met. In Normandy, the same gun bounced off the front of a Tiger, the same way the Shermans did, unless the crew had the scarce tungsten ammunition and a very short range. The newer M18, the Hellcat, pushed the idea to its limit. It carried a 76mm gun and almost no armor at all, about half an inch across the front hull, less than an armored car. It was the fastest tracked vehicle of the war. Its crews used that speed exactly as the doctrine intended, dashing to a German tank's flank, putting a round into the thinner side or rear, and racing off before the turret could come around. The Hellcat knocked out a great many German tanks that way. What it still could not do was stand in front of a Tiger and shoot through the face of it. Every American tank destroyer to reach Normandy was fast, clever, and short one thing, which was a gun that made the flanking dance unnecessary. What the American army lacked was not courage and not numbers. It lacked a gun on a mobile mount that a crew could aim at the front of a Tiger and trust. The gun already existed. It had been sitting in the American inventory since before the war, pointed at the sky. The United States built a superb 90mm anti-aircraft gun in the 1930s, a weapon meant to throw a heavy shell high enough to reach a bomber. The Germans had shown the whole world what an anti-aircraft gun could do when it was turned flat and aimed at armor. Their 88 was an anti-aircraft weapon first. In the summer of 1942, American engineers looked at their own 90mm gun and asked the obvious question. Put it on tracks and point it at tanks, and you would have the German trick in American hands. Getting there took 2 years and nearly did not happen at all. The first attempt to mount the 90 on a tracked chassis, a vehicle called the T-53, went to the testing boards and failed. It did not carry enough ammunition. It stood too tall and made too easy a target. The board that tested it recommended the program be dropped. On the 25th of May, 1944, less than 2 weeks before the men waded ashore in Normandy, the 90mm self-propelled gun project was formally shut down. A second design had been running quietly alongside the first. It took the turret ring of an existing tank destroyer, dropped in a new turret, and fit the 90mm gun into it. This one worked. The army had turned it down once already, then reversed itself and approved it, and on the 1st of June 1944 it was standardized as the M36. The first vehicles came off the line that summer, and the first of them shipped to Europe in September, 2 years after an engineer first suggested the idea. The design that finally worked was a graft. It took the hull of the existing N-10 tank destroyer, already in service and already in production, and fit it with a new turret heavy enough to hold the 90mm gun and its recoil. That saved months. The factories did not have to learn a whole new vehicle, only a new top half. The resistance had come from higher up. Army ground forces had spent 2 years arguing that the tank destroyers on hand were enough. Towed anti-tank guns and the existing 3-inch and 76mm weapons could hold the line. The argument ran, and a heavier gun answered a problem the doctrine insisted would not arise. Normandy settled the argument. British and American crews called the new machine the Jackson, and later the Slugger, though the men who actually crewed it mostly just called it by its number, and the paperwork name never fully stuck. The number was the M36, and what the crews cared about was bolted into the turret. The machine that arrived was a compromise, and every part of the compromise pointed at the gun. It was thinly armored, and its turret was open at the top, exposed to shell fragments and weather, and anything falling from above. It gave up protection for one thing only, which was to carry a gun heavy enough to matter. The 90mm it carried fired an armor-piercing shell at 2,650 feet per second, a shell that could punch nearly 5 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. That was enough to defeat the front of a Tiger at the ranges tanks actually fought. For the crews who wanted more, tungsten-cored high-velocity round left the muzzle at 3,350 feet per second and roughly doubled what the gun could bite through at close range. Cash that into what it meant on the ground. Before the M36, an American crew that met a Tiger head-on had one honest option, which was to survive long enough to get around it. After the M36 reached the line, a crew could sit at 1,000 yards, put the front plate of a Tiger in the sight, and pull the trigger with a real expectation that the round would go through. The exchange the doctrine had accepted, 2 or 3 Shermans for 1 Tiger, stopped being the only way to win the fight. Measure the 90 against the gun that had been beating it, and the reason becomes plain. Armor-piercing shell the M36 fired was close in performance to the 88mm gun in the Tiger's own turret, the weapon that had been reaching out and destroying Shermans at ranges they could not answer for 2 years. For the first time, an American vehicle carried a gun in the same class as the one that had ruled the Norman roads. The Germans had gotten there first by turning an anti-aircraft gun on tanks. The Americans had the same kind of gun in their inventory the whole time, and had simply been slow to put it where it could do the work. When they finally did, the standoff advantage that had defined the Tiger was gone, because now both tanks in the duel could hurt each other at the range the fight opened. None of this depended on the wonder ammunition. The tungsten-cored high-velocity round was the best thing the gun could fire, and it was almost never on hand. Tungsten was scarce, and the shells were rationed. Crew was lucky to carry a handful for the whole fight. It did not matter as much as it would have with a lesser gun. The standard armor-piercing shell, the one that came in quantity, already had the reach to defeat a Tiger's front at the ranges of the Bocage and the Ardennes. For the hardest targets at the closest ranges, the high-velocity round was the bonus. Ordinary round was enough to change the rule. The place that proved it was not Normandy. By the time enough 90mm guns reached the front, the Bocage was behind the Americans and the fighting had moved east toward Germany. The M36 saw its first combat in October 1944 along the West Wall, the belt of German fortifications the Americans called the Siegfried Line. The 7th Tank Destroyer Battalion had traded in its old M10s on the 30th of September and gone straight into the fighting on the German border, part of the time attached to the 3rd Armored Division. The crews took to the new vehicle at once for one plain reason. It was one of the few Allied machines that could reach out and destroy German heavy armor at a distance, instead of waiting for it to close and hoping for a flank. Word of that spread through the tank destroyer battalions faster than the vehicles themselves could be delivered. The reckoning that proved the point came a few weeks later in the snow. December 1944, the Ardennes. You are the commander of an M36 in the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, and 3 days ago your war looked nearly finished. Now a German offensive has torn a hole in the American line, and the tanks pouring through it are the heavy armor you spent all summer learning to run from. Your battalion has been thrown in beside the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne near the crossroads country around Wittmann, and the fog is so thick you can hear the German engines before you can see a thing. Your battalion re-equipped from the old M10 to the M36 back on the 30th of September. Every man in the crew knows the difference the swap made. The old gun could not be trusted against the tanks in front of you. The new one can. When a German tank noses out of the mist a few hundred yards off, you do not reach for smoke and you do not look for a flank. You lay the 90mm on it and fire. The loader is already sliding the next round home before the first one lands. The open turret over your head, the thing the crews cursed in the rain and the cold, gives you a clear view and clear air when the breech throws its smoke back. Your gun has a muzzle brake on the end of the barrel that kicks the blast sideways, so the dust does not blind you and the whole vehicle does not rock off the target. You hold your ground and you keep firing. That is the sentence that would have gotten the Sherman crew destroyed a summer earlier, and it is the exact thing the 90mm now lets you do. The fog that hides the enemy hides you too, and the tank that once dictated the range no longer owns it. The German heavy armor in the Ardennes was a mix. Panthers with a well-sloped front that could turn a lesser round went down to the 90mm at combat range. Where a Sherman crew would have been maneuvering for a side shot and losing tanks to buy it, the M36 crews took Panthers from the front. The heaviest German tank in the offensive was the King Tiger, and it was a harder proposition. The men in the tank destroyers were honest about it. Testing that very battalion ran in December concluded the 90mm could not be counted on to defeat a King Tiger's front at any range with the ammunition on hand. So the crews did with the King Tiger what the Germans had once forced on them. They worked for the flank. The difference was that now, when the shot came, the gun finished the job. The German spearhead that had aimed for the Meuse never reached it. The strongest column, built around King Tigers, ran short of fuel and got pinned in the village of La Glaise. Its commander abandoned more than 100 vehicles there before he pulled his surviving men out on foot. One of the King Tigers he left sits in that street to this day as a monument. The offensive that was supposed to split the American line was fought to a stop, and in the tank versus tank fighting that stopped it, the M36 was the American weapon that could be counted on when a tiger came out of the trees. The record backs the reputation. Across the winter fighting, the M36 was judged the most effective tank destroyer the Americans fielded, the one vehicle in the inventory whose gun could reliably reach the heavy German armor at useful range. It was not the only American weapon that could hurt a tiger. No honest account claims it was. Was the one a crew could trust to do it, and after 2 years of trading Shermans for the privilege of a flank shot, trust was the whole revolution. You can read the change in how the crews behaved. The tank destroyer battalions that had the 90mm stopped asking to be routed around the German heavy armor and started asking to be pointed at it. A vehicle that had been an ambush weapon, a thing that shot once from cover and displaced before the reply came, could now hold a firing position and win a straight exchange. The paratroopers around Wittmann and the crossroads villages, men with rifles and little else against a tank, learned to fall back on the M36s and let the 90 do the answering when the engines got loud in the fog. That reversal of who waited for whom is the quiet measure of the whole thing. The German tank commander in Normandy had chosen the ground and the range and the moment. 6 months later, in the snow, the choice belonged to the crew of a thin American tank destroyer with an oversized gun. There are the long shots too, the ones that show what the gun could do at the edge of its reach. An after-action report credited Lieutenant Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion with a Panther knocked out at more than 4,000 yards, near the very limit of what the gun sight could even range. Historians argue about whether the distance was measured or estimated, and that argument is worth having, because a claim at the edge of possibility deserves the scrutiny. What is not in dispute is the shape of it. Crews were now taking shots at German armor from ranges that would have been a fantasy with the old 75, and connecting often enough that the ranges kept climbing. By the middle of December, only about 236 M36s had reached the fighting units. It was a thin presence for a machine that mattered so much, and it tells you how sharp the shortage of a real anti-tank gun had been. Where the M36 went, the local balance changed. 7 tank destroyer battalions had converted to it by the end of the year, and over the months that followed it, steadily pushed the older vehicles out of the line. The gun that had been cancelled in May was the gun everyone wanted by winter. The army had learned the lesson twice over by then. The same 90mm gun went into the turret of the new Pershing heavy tank, the M26. It reached the front in the last months of the war and gave the American armor branch its own answer to the Tiger at last. The M36 had simply gotten there first, on a thin open hull, because a tank destroyer built on an existing chassis could be fielded faster than a whole new tank. The vehicle outlived the war it was built for by decades. It served in Korea, where its guns still handled the armor it met, and it soldiered on in foreign armies into the 1990s, half a century after it was drawn up to solve one specific problem on the roads of France. A design that keeps working for 50 years was not a lucky patch. It was the right gun, finally put on tracks. Think back to the sunken lane and the burning lead tank and the Tiger nobody could see. That was the true face of Normandy in the summer of 1944, and it was earned. The Tiger was a genuinely superb machine, its armor and its gun a real and deadly advantage, and the fear it built on the Norman roads was not propaganda. The men who beat it did not pretend the threat was small. They beat it by finally building a gun that could answer the one the Tiger carried. The 90mm on the M36 was that gun. It took a weapon designed to shoot at aircraft and an idea the Germans handed the world with their 88. It took a program the army cancelled and then resurrected, And it took a crew willing to sit still and take the shot instead of running for the flank. Those together, and the road stopped belonging to the Tiger. A crew could meet the most feared tank in Normandy head-on and expect to drive away, and by the end of the winter, that expectation was simply the truth. If you crewed an M36 or loaded that 90mm or know a man who did, leave it in the comments. Tell me the vehicle you would put up against the Tiger if the 90 had never made it out of that Maryland testing ground. And tell me which pairing you want next, the feared German weapon and the American answer that ended its run, and I will bring you the day the two of them met.